Richard Dawkins is Professor for the Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University. The evolutionary biologist has outspoken views on religion, the teaching of science, and what he calls pseudoscience. He talked to Sheena McDonald about the falling numbers studying science at GCSE and A-level.
Well, the government's response to this perceived lack of enthusiasm for science has been to refashion the GCSE curriculum. So it's themed now, science teaching. Do you think that will work?
What we want to show children is how enthralling science can be. It's not about non-stick frying pans. It's not about the usefulness of science, or it shouldn't be. And I fear that that's the thrust of the themed initiative. What I'd like to see is, by all means, move at least partly out of the lab, at least partly move away from the cult of the Bunsen burner, towards the universe, geological time, evolution, the diversity of life, the history of life, the enormous spaces and enormous times that we have to cope with, the strange world of the very small, quantum theory, which is very hard to understand, but you can enthrall children with the sheer mysteriousness of it. I think that the same kind of buzz that many children get from science fiction could be used in real science, because real science does have some of the thrill of science fiction, and you completely lose that if you simply stress the everyday usefulness of science, what I call non-stick frying pan science.
Why do you think children give up on science at such an early age?
Well, I must say that when I was at school it was very similar, and I think it's partly that science is treated very much as a practical subject, or certainly was, as what I've mentioned before as the cult of the Bunsen burner. It was thought you had to get your hands dirty all the time, which is, I mean, on the face of it, that sounds like a laudable aim. But it leaves out so much of what's exciting and important. You don't, after all, need to play a musical instrument in order to appreciate music. You could even be taught expertise in music appreciation. You can become an expert music critic, as Bernard Shaw was, for example, without being able to play a note on any instrument. And the early stages of learning a musical instrument, five-finger exercises, can be pretty tedious, just like the early stages of science on the Bunsen burner can be pretty tedious. Somebody has to do it. I mean, we need people to do the five-finger exercises, both in music and in science. But there are a lot of other people who could perhaps be brought to rather an advanced level of science appreciation.
One of the problems is that there are fewer and fewer teachers. Almost a quarter of schools in England don't have anybody with any physics qualification on their staff. So there's the danger of a vicious downward spiral.
Yes, that downward spiral is clearly a risk, and by the very nature of the word spiral, its potential is to get worse. I suppose another thing is that as physical scientists become rarer in universities, they tend to get snapped up for research jobs and for things like jobs in the city. I mean, you know, because they're mathematically skilled, and so you actually, they do have a sellable skill outside the world of academics and education, and indeed outside the world of physics. And so the teaching profession becomes the sort of poor relation, which is absolutely tragic, because it is such an honourable profession and really deserves the very best.
Should the UK give up on science altogether?
Well, what an awful thought, because we've got such an immensely distinguished history right up to recent times, and it could well be said that in the Second World War was won by Britain's physicists as much as by Britain's soldiers. I mean, it was an incredible effort of sheer brain power on the part of British physicists, inventing radar, inventing all sorts of highly ingenious weapon system, defensive as well as offensive, code breaking. British physical science has been second to none, and it would be a real tragedy if this was to disappear in the future. It is an incredible privilege to be alive in a century where so much more is obviously, in any century there's a bit more understood than in previous centuries, but in the century in which we are alive, we know enormously more and understand hugely more than any of our predecessors. To turn our back, for children to turn their back on this just when it starts getting really, really exciting, is so sad, because just think what they're missing.
Now, you've made headlines recently for being very vociferously opposed to teaching creationism in schools. The DFES has said that any such material which is sent to schools is inappropriate to the science curriculum. So there's no danger, is there?
Well, we have to be careful here, because if you say we mustn't teach something, then it looks as though you're trying to suppress it, and that looks intolerant. And it looks as though we've got something to be afraid of, which we certainly haven't. I don't mind at all going into a school and being asked questions about creationism and evolution, and I'm very happy to explain that evolution is a fact. There's no question about it. It's a fact in the same sense as continental drift, that plate tectonics is a fact. It's a fact in the same sense as the Earth orbits the Sun is a fact. There's no doubt about that. But I don't see any great objection to children having class discussions about these issues, because actually it's rather good practice in arguing. It's rather good practice in reasoning. So I don't have a problem with that. I worry about accepting the sort of form of words where people say the two theories ought to be taught, as though there are two theories. That, I think, is what really gets the goat of scientists. It's the implication that there really is a genuine scientific dispute going on when there isn't. It would be a little bit as though in classes on reproduction and sex education there was pressure to give equal time to the stork theory.
Is there any room for God in the curriculum?
I think there's room in the school curriculum for teaching religion, comparative religion. It's a very important part of current affairs, world history. You couldn't even begin to study English history, British history, because it's almost all about wars between Catholics and Protestants, European history. I'm quite surprised at the ignorance of today's children of the Bible compared to those of my generation. Whether you believe it or not, I think it's important to know it as literature, to be able to take your allusions from English literature. It's for the same kind of reason as you need to know about the Olympian gods, the Greek gods, the Roman gods, to appreciate Keats. Gods of history have been so important that you can't appreciate literature without them. And yet, I think very many modern children are really pretty ignorant of scripture.
So when does the teaching of religion become inimical to what should be taught in schools?
Well, I don't think the teaching of religion is ever inimical. What is inimical is teaching a child, this is your religion. I think if you teach comparative religion, you teach about religion as an anthropological, sociological, psychological phenomenon. That's absolutely fine. Teach the Bible as literature. But the moment you say, you are a Catholic child, or you are a Protestant child, you are a Muslim child, that is really wicked. That becomes child abuse, because that means that you're now telling a child who's too young to know that it shares the opinions of its parents, opinions on fundamental things like the cosmos, morality, humanity, the place of humanity, etc.
But isn't it the parents who introduce religion to their children in the first place? Is that child abuse?
You can't stop parents doing anything like that, but what I would say is that it's the duty of the state, of the educational institutions, not to reinforce that. So when a child goes to school, it may already have been told by its parents, you are a Catholic child or you are a Protestant child. But then when it goes to school, it learns that. There are people who call themselves Catholics, there are others who call themselves Protestants, others call themselves Jews, and they're all different. These people believe this, these people believe that, and that would be true education. Whereas sending a child to a segregated sectarian school, which is only for Catholic children or only for Jewish children, that I think is what's wicked.
So what do you think of faith schools and indeed the city academies, which are sponsored by religious benefactors?
I'm rather appalled by faith schools. Of course, there's nothing new about them, but what appalls me is the sort of Me Tooism. Because there have been Protestant and Catholic schools for a long time, then everybody else must get in on the act. It'd be much better to say, yes, it is unfair that we have Christian schools and not Muslim schools, so let's abolish the Christian schools. I don't mean abolish the schools, of course, but I mean abolish the sectarian aspects of them. And you ask also about the city academies, which are often sponsored by rich religious benefactors, sponsored to a very measly extent, I might say. You only have to put up £2 million, and that draws down £20 million of government money. And for that, you get total control over the governorship of the school and the policy of the school, etc. It's a pretty good deal.
Now, you're thinking of setting up a foundation, the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. What's that about?
I've set up two companies, one in Britain, one in America, and both companies are now applying for charitable status in their respective countries. The aim of both of them is quite largely education as well as research. It has been misrepresented, I think very damagingly misrepresented in the press as a sort of anti-religion foundation. It's not that, it's pro-science and pro-reason. If we do get charitable status and manage to raise money, one of the things we would try and do is to go into schools and try to combat the rise of young earth creationism, in which of course we would have the enthusiastic support of bishops and vicars and priests who are even more annoyed by naive creationists than scientists are, because they get religion a very bad name.
Well, what can teachers run away with? I mean, if there was one message you would want them to understand from what you're saying, what would it be?
As a biologist, I think that evolution is absolutely crucial and fundamental, and you can't make any sense of life at all without evolution. And it's therefore odd, to say the least, that evolution gets left rather late in the biology curriculum. Children are taught a whole lot of facts about biology, a whole lot of facts about life, about how the body works, how the kidney works, how the heart works, etc. And the children are never taught, well, what's it all for? Why is it there? What's the underlying rationale for the whole thing? Evolution is that underlying rationale, and it surely ought to come very early in biological education. And not just the education of children who are sort of going to the biology stream, it should be for everybody, because it is the explanation for all our existences. It's the explanation for why we are, and not just us, but all living things, are so elegant and beautiful and carry this superb illusion of design. I think we should start teaching it almost from the cradle.